Medford, Oregon was like a picture-perfect postcard, a quiet, cozy town where everyone knew each other, and each day seemed to blend seamlessly into the next. Medford was a place where time appeared to have stopped, preserving the ideal of the small American dream. Among the neat houses with well-kept lawns and white picket fences stood the Thornton family home on one of the town's most prestigious streets. Daniel Thornton, the head of the family, was a respected businessman. He had built his construction company from the ground up, turning it into one of the most successful in the county. At 50, Daniel embodied discipline and perseverance. His reputation as a man of his word made him not only successful, but also revered in the community. Megan Thornton, his wife, was a beloved teacher at the local school. At 48, her kindness and compassion were undiminished. She always knew how to connect with each student, and her classes were highly sought after. Megan was the heart of the family, always supporting her children and husband, ensuring that their home remained a place of comfort and peace. Matthew and Chloe Thornton, the Thornton children, seemed like the perfect teenagers. Matthew had just turned 18 and was preparing to attend college, planning to follow in his father's footsteps in business. Chloe, a 16-year-old with a bright and talented disposition, dreamed of becoming an artist and often secluded herself in her room, painting her emotions and feelings on canvas. But behind this picture-perfect family facade lay a secret that threatened to destroy everything that seemed so flawless. Matthew and Chloe, who had grown up side by side, had always been close. Their bond, initially innocent and childlike, had begun to take on darker forms over time. Matthew, usually calm and composed, had always been the dependable older brother, but in recent years, his feelings towards Chloe started to change. He found it increasingly difficult to see her as just a little sister, a feeling growing in his heart that both frightened and burdened him. Yet he couldn't fight it. He began to notice that his thoughts about her were becoming obsessive, and attempts to drown them out with schoolwork and sports only deepened his inner conflict. On her part, Chloe began to sense something unusual in Matthew's behavior. She couldn't understand why he had become so distant and withdrawn, or why his eyes sometimes held a strange glint when they were alone. At times, she caught herself realizing that her feelings toward him exceeded the boundaries of typical sibling affection. Her teenage emotions, fueled by her passion for artistic self-expression, only amplified her confusion. She painted images where her feelings for Matthew were hidden beneath layers of symbolism and allegory. Their secret connection, which they were afraid even to acknowledge, began to alter their relationship. They increasingly found excuses to be alone, hiding from prying eyes, unaware that their behavior had already begun to attract attention. Evenings when their parents were occupied became moments when they could be together, trying to make sense of their feelings. This connection became a trap from which there was no escape. Their emotions, both terrifying and magnetic, started to tear them apart from within. They couldn't confess their feelings to each other, nor could they break the bond. Each day, they sank deeper into this dark abyss, not realizing that the consequences of their relationship would be catastrophic. By May 2023, Matthew and Chloe began spending more time together in secluded places where no one could see them. They started meeting in the woods outside town, venturing further from home so that no one would notice their disappearances. During this time, their bond grew even stronger, and they both knew they were on the brink of something they could no longer control. Matthew tried to find a way out of the situation, contemplating options from leaving home to attempting to suppress his feelings, but each time his thoughts returned to Chloe, as if she were his inevitable fate. In June 2023, Chloe, feeling that the situation had become unbearable, began writing a diary where she detailed her feelings for her brother. These entries became her only way to express everything she couldn't say out loud. However, the diary hidden under her pillow became another link in the chain of events leading to tragedy. By July 2023, the secret meetings continued and the tension grew. Detective Jennifer Howard entered their lives, noticing the strange behavior of Matthew and Chloe. She instinctively felt that something was amiss in this family and began her own investigation, suspecting that something much darker lurked behind the facade of this perfect family. The moment was approaching when the illusion of the perfect family would shatter, exposing a tragedy that no one could have predicted. Matthew and Chloe found themselves trapped in a situation of their own making, and the only way out was through chaos and destruction. The summer of 2023 marked a turning point in their lives. In their seemingly peaceful world, the cracks became increasingly apparent. Chloe began to suffer from constant feelings of guilt and shame. Every day was a torment for her. The same question repeatedly ran through her mind. How did we get this far? She feared looking her parents in the eye, worried that they would see the secret she so carefully concealed. Chloe often woke up at night, drenched in cold sweat after nightmares, where she saw herself and Matthew standing on the edge of an abyss. She became withdrawn, distancing herself from friends and abandoning her love of painting. At school, her teachers noticed that Chloe was losing interest in her studies and often seemed lost in thought, as if completely disconnected from reality. She was no longer the cheerful girl everyone once knew. Matthew, on the other hand, tried to keep himself in check, but his inner demons gradually gained control. He became increasingly irritable and prone to aggression. Matthew started avoiding his father, fearing that he would uncover his feelings. He often spent time alone, lost in dark thoughts about what he and Chloe had done. The thought that their bond was not just a mistake, but something much darker and destructive tormented him. Matthew took longer and longer walks, trying to escape these thoughts, but the voices in his head, condemning him for what had happened, continued to grow louder. He didn't know how to silence them. Gradually, Matthew began to feel that he was losing control, and the fear of what he might do became his constant companion. Meanwhile, the Thorntons' neighbor, Tony Ramirez, the owner of a small cafe, began to notice the odd behavior of Matthew and Chloe. Tony was always a keen observer, and his friendship with Daniel Thornton gave him access to the smallest details of the family's life. He had known this family for many years and had always admired their closeness and successes. But now, something was clearly amiss. Tony first sensed something was wrong when he saw Matthew and Chloe leaving the house late one evening and heading toward the woods on the outskirts of town. This place was rarely visited, and Tony wondered why they would go there at such a late hour. He tried to dismiss it, but as these walks became more frequent, his concern grew. One evening, as Tony was closing his cafe, he noticed Matthew and Chloe sitting by the river in a secluded spot. Their conversation seemed tense. They were speaking in hushed tones, and when Tony tried to approach them to say hello, they quickly stood up and left, as if afraid of being seen. This behavior struck Tony as odd, too strange for ordinary teenagers, and it sparked his suspicions. Tony wasn't one to panic easily, but something about Matthew and Chloe's behavior troubled him deeply. He started keeping an eye on them, trying to understand what was going on. Each time he saw them leave the house, his concern grew. Tony noticed that their meetings were becoming more frequent and took place in locations where no one could see them. Gradually, paranoia began to take root in Tony's mind. He couldn't stop thinking that these kids were hiding something terrible. By August 2023, Matthew and Chloe began spending more and more time in the woods, avoiding people. They understood that their bond was becoming increasingly dangerous, but they couldn't stop. Tony Ramirez, struggling with growing anxiety, started to suspect that there was something much darker behind their secret meetings than just youthful mischief. In September 2023, Tony decided that he couldn't stay silent any longer. He reached out to Detective Jennifer Howard, sharing his observations with her. Jennifer, who had already suspected that something was wrong in the Thornton family, decided to launch her own investigation. She knew that time was running out and that they needed to act quickly before something irreversible happened. The first cracks in Matthew and Chloe's lives marked the beginning of the end. The secret they had so carefully hidden began to surface, threatening to destroy not just their lives but the entire world they knew. By the fall of 2023, events in Matthew and Chloe's lives had begun to unravel their emotional stability completely. Chloe, struggling to cope with guilt and her confused feelings toward her brother, decided to try to reconnect with those around her. She started socializing more with her classmates, attempting to distract herself from her inner turmoil. However, her attempts at building connections with others proved futile. Chloe couldn't shake the constant feeling that her secret was about to be exposed, that everyone knew what lay behind her smile. This fear destroyed any possibility of normal interaction. Every new acquaintance ended in failure for her. Chloe even tried to start a relationship with a classmate named Brandon Cooper, but each of their meetings was filled with awkwardness and underlying anxiety. Her thoughts inevitably returned to Matthew, making it impossible to develop any relationship. Soon, she completely distanced herself from Brandon, which only deepened her isolation. Meanwhile, Matthew, seeing that Chloe was trying to distance herself from him, sank deeper into his dark thoughts. His obsession with his sister had reached a point where he couldn't think about anything else. Every moment apart from her felt like losing a part of himself. These feelings grew into a fixation that their bond was something special, something they couldn't allow anyone or anything to destroy. Gradually, Matthew's obsession began to take on darker forms. He started noticing that Chloe was pulling away from him, and this triggered a panic in him. Matthew began acting more aggressively. He would have jealous outbursts when he saw Chloe talking to other guys, even if they were just her friends. He became enraged at the mere thought that someone could take his place in his sister's life. Chloe tried to calm her brother, explaining that she needed space, that she wanted to be a normal girl and have normal relationships. But Matthew wouldn't accept this. His aggression increasingly turned into emotional manipulation. He started pressuring his sister, convincing her that they couldn't live without each other. He told her that their bond was the only thing that mattered, and that no one would ever understand them except themselves. Matthew manipulated Chloe, making her believe that their love was unique, and that she shouldn't listen to those around her, who would never understand them. He insisted that they had to be together at any cost, even if it meant running away and leaving everything behind. These conversations became a nightmare for Chloe. She realized that her brother was no longer in control of himself and that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. By October 2023, the tension between the siblings had reached its peak. Matthew began stalking Chloe, following her wherever she went. He would appear near her school, wait for her outside their home, giving her no moment of peace. Chloe felt trapped, without the strength or will to resist. She feared that Matthew was capable of something terrible if she tried to leave. One evening, when their parents were at work, Matthew created yet another scene. He locked himself in Chloe's room with her, refusing to let her out until they talked. His voice had a threatening tone, and Chloe realized that he might move from words to actions. Matthew accused her of betrayal, of wanting to leave him alone. He said that if she left, he wouldn't be able to go on living. That night became a turning point for Chloe. She understood that she could no longer hide her fear and needed to find a way out of this nightmare. From that moment, their bond fully transformed into a painful knot that tightened more and more. Matthew and Chloe, once close, were now prisoners of their own passion and fear. They understood that they were on a path that could only lead to disaster, but neither knew how to stop this relentless process. In November 2023, Chloe tried to seek help from her school friend Lisa, but couldn't explain what was really happening in her life. The fear of Matthew and the shame of what bound them were too overwhelming. She became even more withdrawn, avoiding any attempts at closeness. Matthew, on the other hand, started making plans for a future where it would be just him and Chloe, with no one else. But he already knew that this plan might require extreme measures. The escalation of tension reached its peak, and the tragic path was already set. Matthew and Chloe drifted further and further from reality, entangled in their feelings and fears. They stood on the edge of an abyss, and only time would tell who would make the first step toward the inevitable. By December 2023, the days were growing shorter, and the tension between Matthew and Chloe was growing stronger. Under the relentless pressure from Matthew, Chloe, exhausted by guilt and helplessness, finally agreed to his plan to run away. They began working out the details, filled with fear and uncertainty. Matthew convinced her that the only way to preserve their bond was to leave town and start over in a place where no one knew them and where they could hide from judgment and the law. The plan was risky and demanded quick action. Matthew meticulously thought through every detail. They would take only the essentials, leave their cell phones behind so they couldn't be tracked, and slip away into the night while their parents were sound asleep. They intended to leave as few traces as possible, ensuring that neither the police nor anyone else could find them. Chloe felt the urgency of time slipping away. She constantly looked over her shoulder, convinced that their secret was already out. Every sound in the house, every footstep outside the door, made her heart race. Matthew, on the other hand, was growing increasingly aggressive and insistent. He kept pressing that they needed to act immediately, that every minute of delay brought them closer to being exposed. His obsession with saving their forbidden love was only intensifying. The night before their escape arrived faster than they expected. The oppressive silence in the house only heightened their anxiety. They packed their things in complete silence, trying not to make a single sound. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked. Matthew and Chloe froze. The door to their room flew open, and there stood Daniel, their father. His face was twisted in confusion and suspicion. He looked at the suitcases and backpacks his children were hastily trying to hide, and knew something was wrong. Daniel demanded an explanation, his voice growing louder and more threatening. He wanted to know what they were planning, why they were packing in the middle of the night, and what secrets they were hiding. Matthew, gripped by panic, tried to keep his composure, but his desperation grew with each passing second. He knew that if Daniel found out the truth, it would all be over. His fear of losing Chloe, who meant everything to him, overwhelmed him. In that moment, something inside him snapped. A surge of rage consumed Matthew. In a fit of anger and despair, he grabbed his father by the shoulders and shoved him with force. Daniel, caught off guard, lost his balance and fell backward. Time seemed to slow as his body tumbled down the stairs. The dull thud of his head hitting the wooden steps echoed through the house. Chloe screamed, but it was more of a rasping sound. She rushed to her father, but it was too late. Daniel Thornton lay motionless, his eyes open but devoid of life. Chloe stared at her father's body, unable to believe what had just happened. Her world collapsed in an instant. She felt the ground give way beneath her feet, and terror consumed her. But instead of panicking, she instinctively knew they had no choice now. Matthew, still in shock, stared at his father, unable to move. Chloe, summoning all her strength, grabbed her brother's hand and began urging him to run. Her voice trembled, but there was a steely determination in it. She understood that their lives were now completely shattered, that there was no turning back, and if they didn't leave immediately, they would be caught, and things would end even worse. Matthew, still dazed, reluctantly agreed. They gathered the remaining items and left the house, leaving behind only death and chaos. The night was dark, the air cold and damp. They raced through the streets, not looking back, not thinking about where they were going. Their hearts were filled with fear and desperation, and ahead of them lay only an unknown, terrifying path. Thus began their flight, fraught with dark forebodings and the inevitable catastrophe that loomed over them. On December 10th, 2023, Matthew and Chloe left the house where tragedy had just occurred, leaving behind everything they knew and loved. Their hearts pounded in unison with their hurried steps, their thoughts tangled in fear and despair. In the darkness of Medford, they ran, trying to evade the justice they were now certain would inevitably catch up with them. But the further they went, the more paranoia began to set in. Matthew and Chloe could no longer even trust each other. Every step was accompanied by the torturous feeling that someone was watching them, that someone was about to catch them. They avoided crowded places, fearing they would be recognized, and hid in the shadows, where the fear only grew. Around every corner, in every passerby, they saw a threat. They didn't know where to go, had no plan, and, most importantly, no idea how to escape the guilt that was slowly eating them alive. Their entire existence became a never-ending flight to nowhere, where reality started to warp and distort under the pressure of fear and horror. Soon, their escape turned into a living nightmare. After days of wandering nameless roads and nights spent in cheap motels, Chloe began noticing strange things creeping into her consciousness. She couldn't shake the horrific visions that haunted her at all hours. The scene of her father's death replayed over and over in her mind, his body lying on the floor, blood slowly spreading across the wooden steps, almost as if it were alive. Soon, these visions turned into hallucinations. Her father would rise from the floor, reach out to her, his dead eyes staring into her soul, accusing and cursing her. Matthew was not immune to this madness either. He began hearing his father's voice, stern and full of condemnation. The voice echoed in his head, sometimes growing louder and more insistent. It reproached Matthew, called him a traitor and a murderer, and told him that their life was now a punishment for what they had done. Matthew tried to fight it, but the harder he tried, the more the voice took hold of his mind. Soon, Matthew could no longer tell where reality ended and this nightmare began. Paranoia and guilt pulled them into an endless vortex of terror from which there seemed to be no escape. They stopped trusting each other. Every glance, every gesture seemed suspicious. Chloe withdrew further into herself, while Matthew began to lose control of his emotions, sinking into a pit of despair and self-destruction. Their physical condition also deteriorated. Endless hours without sleep, and the constant fear of being caught, led to exhaustion. They could barely eat and could hardly think of anything other than the terror that followed them at every step. Matthew began wasting away, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. Chloe didn't look much better. Her once lively face was now pale, with dark circles under her eyes, and it seemed she was living on the edge of a nervous breakdown. With each passing day, their flight became more chaotic and desperate. They tried to get as far away as possible from the place where their tragedy began, but the horror kept following them like a shadow. Every night, they woke up in cold sweats, hearing screams and seeing ghostly images in the dark. Their minds were torn between the desire to end it all and the fear of the inevitable reckoning. This unbearable reality, where each new day brought more suffering, had turned their lives into an endless nightmare. They no longer lived, but merely existed, sinking deeper into the abyss of despair and terror. On December 20th, 2023, their escape reached its dramatic conclusion. After weeks of futile attempts to stay hidden, they found refuge in an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. This house, long forgotten and deserted, became their final sanctuary, the place where their mental state reached its breaking point. Detective Karen Simmons, known for her sharp mind and keen intuition, had finally tracked them down by piecing together their route through surveillance footage and witness statements. Matthew and Chloe, already broken by internal horror and guilt, didn't expect to be found so soon. When the police surrounded the house, Matthew and Chloe didn't even try to hide. It was as if they had lost the will to live. Chloe, upon seeing the detective's arrival, broke into hysteria, screaming and begging to be left alone. She tried to convince Detective Simmons that they were innocent, that it was all some terrible misunderstanding, but her words were incoherent, full of despair and fear, which only solidified the police's belief that they were witnessing a tragic conclusion. Matthew, in contrast, seemed completely detached. He sat on the floor, unresponsive to his sister's cries and the police's orders to stand up and surrender. His gaze was empty, and it appeared he had already given up inside. When they lifted him and placed handcuffs on him, he didn't even try to resist. Only a single tear rolled down his cheek as he finally met Detective Simmons's eyes, realizing this was the end. After Matthew and Chloe were arrested, the police conducted a thorough search of the abandoned house where they had been hiding. In one of the rooms, tucked away under a pile of old furniture, they found a small box filled with diaries and letters that the siblings had written to each other over the past several months. These documents became key evidence, revealing the twisted emotional world that Matthew and Chloe had lived in. Chloe's diary entries were filled with confessions of her internal struggle, guilt, and the fear that their secret would destroy everything. She wrote about how she tried to resist Matthew's manipulation, but how she also felt trapped by her own conflicted emotions. Her letters to Matthew were laced with fear and a desperate need to understand what was happening between them. In stark contrast, Matthew's diary exposed his growing obsession with Chloe. His entries were filled with jealousy and possessiveness, detailing his increasing rage toward anyone who might take her away from him. His letters to Chloe spoke of their love as something unique and powerful, a bond that no one could break. The discovery of these writings left no doubt in the minds of investigators that the Thornton siblings had descended into a dangerous, emotional abyss. These diaries and letters were presented as evidence during the trial, providing a glimpse into the psychological state of both Matthew and Chloe in the months leading up to their father's death. The once perfect image of the Thornton family was shattered, exposing the devastating impact of the secret that had consumed them. On March 25, 2024, the judge delivered a verdict that marked the end of one of the most shocking trials in Medford's history. Matthew Thornton was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years, but with mandatory psychiatric supervision. Chloe Thornton, whose role in the crime was seen as complicity under duress, received 20 years, with the possibility of parole after 15 years, also with mandatory psychiatric treatment throughout her sentence. The courtroom was silent when the sentences were announced. Chloe wept quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't say a word. Matthew, on the other hand, seemed completely detached from the proceedings. His face was emotionless, but inside he was being torn apart by the weight of what had happened. They had lost everything: their family, their freedom, and, most tragically, each other. After the trial, the town of Medford would never be the same. The Thornton home, once a symbol of success and prosperity, became a grim monument to the tragedy. The townspeople, shaken by the horror of what had occurred, began avoiding the subject altogether, as though even speaking the Thornton name might bring misfortune. Legends about the Thornton house quickly spread. Some said the house was cursed, that strange sounds could be heard at night, and others claimed to have seen shadows moving through the windows, though the house had long been abandoned. Daniel Thornton's construction business was shut down. Megan Thornton, the mother of Matthew and Chloe, was found in a state of shock in her bedroom a few days after the verdict. She was hospitalized for an extended period, and, following her release, she lived in isolation, unable to face the world after losing her entire family. The people of Medford, now wary of the family's dark past, stopped talking about them entirely, as if they were trying to erase the memory of what had happened. Matthew and Chloe, separated in different prisons, lived the rest of their lives in isolation, not only from each other but from the world they had once known. Their lives became an endless nightmare, where memories of their father's death and the events leading up to it haunted them relentlessly. Chloe, in her solitary cell, suffered from constant nightmares, her mental state deteriorating as she withdrew further into herself. She refused to communicate with prison psychologists, and in her rare letters, addressed to Matthew but never sent, she begged him for forgiveness and forgave him in return. Matthew, too, found no solace in his imprisonment. He was tormented by hallucinations of his father's voice, accusing him of betrayal. These voices became part of his daily life, driving him deeper into despair. He barely interacted with other inmates and spent most of his time alone, arguing out loud with the hallucinations that only he could hear. The Thornton family's tragic story became part of Medford's folklore, a cautionary tale that parents would tell their children about the dangers of hiding dark secrets. The Thornton house stood abandoned for years, avoided by the locals, and eventually it was torn down. But the memory of what had happened lingered in the town's collective consciousness, a grim reminder that even the most peaceful and idyllic places can harbor the darkest of secrets. Medford would move on, but the shadow of the Thornton tragedy would never fully disappear. The story of Matthew and Chloe Thornton, their forbidden bond, and the devastating consequences of their actions became a dark chapter in the town's history, one that would never be forgotten.